frameworks in LGBTQ psychology. To start off today, I want you to think about what a framework even is, right? We throw out this term a lot, and I think you have a general idea in your head. But I'd like you to think about scaffolding and the framework that goes into building a building. A framework is simply the structure that supports another object, a building, vehicle, or other kind of construction. It's the basic structure that underlines something. In psychology, and specifically today, we're going to be talking about frameworks or structures that underlie how we build knowledge of human behavior, specifically how we build knowledge about sex, gender, and sexuality. So there are different frameworks that underlie how we build that knowledge: essentialism, critical realism, queer theory, etc., and other ones outside of this. Today, we're just going to focus on the first two, because that's what we got time for. Starting off with essentialism. Simply put, this is a framework that underlies how we gather knowledge that assumes a binary model of gender. If you remember last week, we talked about binary ways of thinking of sex, gender, and sexuality. You can kind of take that and apply it to essentialism. Basically, essentialism holds those same general ideas that sex, gender, and sexuality are inherent, innate, and biologically based, that sex and gender are relatively interchangeable, and that we can fit people into discrete categories such as gay or lesbian or bisexual. Typically in this framework, sexuality is referred to as sexual orientation, and it assumes that people fit nicely into these little boxes of lesbian, gay, and bisexual. And, like how sex and gender are seen as interchangeable, in this view, different aspects of sexuality are seen as interchangeable as well. That romantic feelings, sexual feelings, and behaviors all go together and then fit in these discrete packages of lesbian, gay, and bisexual. Now, as you can guess, the critiques that we brought up for binary ways of thinking also apply to essentialism, in that it leaves little room for people that have non-binary ways of identification or of seeing their own gender, sex, and sexuality. So people, for example, who identify as genderqueer or pan or asexual. Now, this viewpoint, essentialism, is probably one of the oldest ways that people have looked at social sciences or have used to frame social sciences. And it grew out of some very early research in the realms of sexuality. Specifically, it grew out of a critique against a common view at the time that non-heterosexual identities were a willful and criminal behavior. What these early scholars of sexuality research proposed was that these different ways of thinking were not willful, but were just part of how someone was born, how someone came out, part of their biology, part of their DNA. They also tended to suggest that this was a mental illness or abnormality that people were born with, and therefore you shouldn't discriminate against them because they couldn't control it, because that's just how they were. So, a little bit of pro, a little bit of con there. A problem with this perspective is that even though it assumes that no one chooses to be gay, and therefore, you shouldn't be discriminated against, it also tended to view being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender as something that's not natural, something that needs to be understood and studied to find out the potential causes or cures. Now, in early research in psychology, often this viewpoint was paired with some religious views of homosexuality as a sin, as being wrong, and it led to the development of various interventions that sought to cure people of their homosexuality, as they put it. You might know these as conversion therapies. So we won't go too much into conversion therapy, but if you're interested, it's basically a practice of trying to cure someone of their non heterosexual orientation. If someone is gay or lesbian or bisexual, it is therapy that seeks to change that, to make them heterosexual, using psychological, physical, or spiritual interventions. Often this is not very pretty, and if you want to learn more about it, if you want to hear people's experiences of conversion therapy, you can watch this video. I'll include the video in the link. Overall, in the US, there are, I want to say, roughly 10 states that have banned conversion therapy in them. However, that leaves many other places in the US where conversion therapy continues today. As you can probably guess, there are a lot of problems and critiques that come out of essentialism, even though it's one of the really most common frameworks that's used when studying sex, gender, and sexuality, at least in the terms of psychology. On the other side of things, we have the social constructionism perspective. And this one you can think of as an ardent critique of essentialism. It challenges the essentialist view that sex, gender, and sexuality are inherent, innate, and biologically determined. In this framework, it views sex, gender, and sexuality as social constructions, as references, as labels that we put onto a constellation of various things, but whose meanings differ culture to culture, time to time, period to period, society to society, and whose labels, lesbian, gay, heterosexual, bisexual, don't necessarily get at an essential truth. Whereas essentialism puts weights in these labels and holds that they represent really what's innate, what is natural, what is already there within you. The social constructionist perspective puts the focus on how the labels are just words, that the words they represent, the meanings that they represent, can change, and they're not the same thing. The words we use to represent these identities don't get at necessarily the core of who that person is. The social constructionist perspective asks us to consider, instead, contexts and how people identify, and how these contexts can shape the way that they identify. It holds that sex, gender, and sexuality can't be understood without understanding the contexts that they occur in. That these historical contexts, these social contexts, these cultural values and norms shape the way that people see themselves. And depending if you lived in a different history, a different time, a different culture, the words you use to describe yourself could change. In one time period, you might identify as heterosexual. Maybe in a time period where being gay isn't even a thing that you understood could exist. Or if you did, you understood it as something wrong or hateful or sinful. Compared to another time where that same person might freely embrace that label and call themselves lesbian, gay, pan, bisexual, or describe themselves in other ways, non-binary ways. Because in that historical or cultural context, they feel able to, they feel supported, and that these identities aren't stigmatized. What this perspective emphasizes in that regard is agency. Not necessarily that people get to choose every day, it's a different choice, like, am I going to be this today or am I going to be that? Their sex, gender, or sexuality. But that people have a role in understanding and defining who they are, and that's shaped by the context that they live, the time period, the history, the culture. And depending on the time you live in, that some identities are seen as more possible, reachable, or desirable, and others are invisible, not even on your radar, or marginalized. So these are just a few frameworks that scholars have used to understand sex, gender, and sexuality. Today, we only covered essentialism and social constructionism. And I will say between the two, many more studies exist that take an essentialist perspective, that assume difference is a deficit, that assumes we need to compare lesbian, gay, and heterosexual people in order to understand whether they're different from each other, and in order to determine whether they have similar or different outcomes, where if they have different outcomes from heterosexual people, they're worse. In comparison, relatively fewer studies take a social constructionist perspective that allow more freedom for the ways we define sex, gender, and sexuality. There are other perspectives that we haven't covered, so if you're interested, look into them.